with Polly Hamilton and the blood clot that is affecting her, and we pray that the doctors will be able to fix that to give her good health. And we uh, also pray for Nancy's daughter, Joyce, and her situation. We pray that you will put your loving, caring arms around each and every one of these. We thank you again so much for your son, Jesus, and we ask you to guide, guard, and direct us today and forgive us of our sins. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Okay, we'll be in, if I can get this frog out of here, we'll be in chapter 28 in Acts this morning. And first, we're going to have our Dr. Maynard and his short video, and he's going to explain some things to you, and I'll try to add a few details to him when we're finished. If you go ahead and start that.
Paul's trip to Rome was really a difficult one. Of course, the Bible is going to narrate that there's a shipwreck, the storm is really problematic, and the ship starts to break apart, and then they come to land, and they're going to discover this island that they are stranded on. And when they had been brought safely through, then we found out that the island was called Malta. The natives showed us extraordinary kindness. For because of the rain that had set in and because of the cold, they kindled a fire and received us all. This kindness extended to them becomes a very significant element of the story. But when we think in terms of the trip, the ship, of course, meanders as it has left Crete because of the storm. It's blown around all over the place, and they eventually end up at this island of Malta. And the map shows this as almost a little speck between Sicily and the northern coast of Africa. It's really quite a small island. Here's a Google map view of the island. The big island actually is called Malta, but all of the area is called Malta. But to give some sense of the size of this, the big island is only twice the size of the Sea of Galilee. If you visited Israel and seen the Sea of Galilee, you can imagine, that this is a really tiny island. And Paul and his company are all shipwrecked on this. And of course, the Bible is going to talk about this kindling a fire, and Paul is assisting in keeping the fire going. He gathers up this bundle of sticks and puts them on the fire, and this snake comes out and latches onto him. And this becomes a focal point of a lot of concern. A lot of the people on the island believe that maybe he's a murderer, and hence justice is being meted out. And of course, Paul just shakes the snake off into the fire and suffers no ill effects whatsoever. The academic world, the skeptics in particular, have often latched onto this story and argued, see, this is the inaccuracy of Luke, the author, because there are no poisonous snakes on the island of Malta. But that's an illegitimate charge to bring up, because thousands of years have been separated from the time this event takes place till now, and the island is quite small, and I can easily imagine the people living on the island would watch out for poisonous snakes and through the years kill them all off. So just because there aren't poisonous snakes now doesn't say anything about whether there were in antiquity or not. And I would tend certainly to side with Luke and the accuracy, because he's so accurate in everything else. So we'll go with the idea that there are indeed snakes. There were on the island. Another interesting thing about this passage, verses 1 are the number of medical terms that appear. I mean, we're talking about only 10 verses. Admittedly, some of the terms here are terms that, you and I might use in our everyday kind of conversation describing ailments that we might have, but some of them are quite specialized. I'm not going to go into details of all of these, but this is a list of the various terms, the passages in which they're found, and the fact that you have this concentration of these 5 medical type terms, some of which are very specialized and don't appear anywhere else in the New Testament or in the Septuagint, but are sometimes used in medical documents of the ancient world, tends to point to somebody with an education to that end. Of course, that's not surprising. We, in company with Paul in this discussion of travel, And Paul, at the end of Colossians, will talk about Luke, the beloved physician, sends you his greetings. Luke, the beloved physician. People in the ancient world had doctors and physicians. And Luke being along, it would not be surprising that he would tend to use medical kind of terms to describe things. As you travel into the Mediterranean world and travel around in the Greek sites and the Roman sites, one of the things oftentimes you'll see will be medical instruments. Here is a display of medical instruments, replicas in this case, that I've secured through the years. And in a very real sense, these are functionally no different than the kind of medical tools that physicians have used up until very recent times and often still will use. Admittedly, we've advanced to lasers and other kinds of surgeries, but until the introduction of those things, these were the kinds of tools that physicians would have used, and apparently Luke would have been familiar with these and perhaps even used them on occasion in his travels. But another element we need to consider. The reference in the passage that we read refers to the natives of the island. Some versions will refer to them as the residents that live there or something along that line, but the word in the Greek is the word barbaros, which is the word from which we get barbarian. Now, I understand why the translations don't use barbarian, because that conjures in our mind, uncouth kind of ill-bred people kind of thing. And while there may be occasions in the ancient world when the word was used in that fashion, in the ancient literature, typically the word barbarian refers not to an uncouth character or something like that, but to someone that didn't speak the Greek language. Now, admittedly, there are occasions it would be used to refer to someone that was ill-bred and so forth, but typically in the New Testament, the word barbarian does not refer to that, but simply to someone that doesn't speak the language of Greece. But as the story unfolds, it's interesting the kindness of the people on the island of Malta. And you have several references. In verse 2, they showed us extraordinary kindness. Verse 2 again, they kindled a fire and received us all. Verse 7, Publius welcomed and entertained us. And then in verse 10, the people honored us with many marks of respect. And verse 10 as well, they supplied us with all that we needed. As human beings, we need to recognize kindness transcends culture. And we need to be careful about making judgments about people on all kinds of criteria that regretfully we often use. We're all made in the image of God, and all human beings have the ability to be kind and considerate. And that also is an aspect that all human beings have a right to hear the gospel of Christ. And I can only imagine what the impact of Paul's ministry for this relatively brief period of time would have been on the island of Malta. Certainly, he influenced significantly Publius and at least a number of others. And may we do the same.
Okay, a lot of what he has said, I'll give you a little bit more information about it as we go along. If I can remember how to use this thing. Acts 28, starting in verse 1. When they had been brought safely through, then we found out that the island was called Malta. The natives showed us extraordinary kindness, for because of the rain that had set in and because of the cold, they kindled a fire and received us all. But when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened itself on his hand. When the natives saw the creature hanging from his hand, they began saying to one another, "Undoubtedly, this man is a murderer, and though he has been saved from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live." However, he shook the creature off into the fire and suffered no harm. But they were expecting that he was about to swell up or suddenly fall down dead. But after they had waited a long time and had seen nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and began to say that he was a god. The chapter begins with Paul and his travels, and if you remember, Randy showed us a map, and you can see where, oh, good, it works. He started there and he went up north, and then they were skirted along there, which is the southern part of what we call Turkey. Came down and went around Crete and went to past Fair Havens. And Randy told us the reason they were doing that way was because of the storms on the sea. Well, when they got to Fair Havens in 1980, it's been said that they filmed a naval documentary there. But it wasn't a naval documentary, it was a movie. And the movie was called Popeye. At Fair Havens, this is the village they filmed it at. This village is still there, and you can still go there. Well, finally, they moved on southwest, driven to and fro, and then chapter 27, verse 27 says they were grounded off the coast of Malta. And Paul found himself on the island of Malta, and he was not where he wanted to be. He wanted to be in Rome. In the 19th chapter, 21st verse, it says, "Now after these things were finished, Paul resolved to go to Jerusalem, after he had passed through Macedonia and Achaia, saying, after I have been there, I must also see Rome." Well, after his arrest in Jerusalem, the Lord himself had assured him that he would witness in Rome. In chapter 23, verse 11, it says, "But on the following night, the Lord stood near him and said, be courageous, for as you have testified to the truth about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify in Rome also." And on his journey, God had promised him that he would stand before Caesar, and that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to stand before Caesar and argue his case with him. And Paul tells of an angel of the God to whom I belong told me, saying, "Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has graciously granted you and all those who are sailing with you." Paul expected to be in Rome, not on a tiny island miles from where he wanted to be. If you look at the first map we showed, right there, you see that big place right there? That's Malta. That's a little closer view of it for you. And whether how true it is or not, but right there, it says St. Paul's Bay. So we're assuming that's where they landed. Now you can imagine. I'm sorry, this frog's going to kill us. You can imagine Paul and the rest of the survivors on the beach, breathless, soaked to the skin because they swam ashore, hungry because for the last 2 weeks they've been fighting this storm and everything, shivering, huddled together. And some of the sailors may have known that the island was called Malta, or maybe the inhabitants themselves told them. But the island is Malta. And Malta is translated meaning refuge. It's an island that's 18 miles long, 8 miles wide, located 58 miles south of Sicily in the Mediterranean, and somewhere between Italy and North Africa. The first settlers there were Phoenicians, and they are the ones that kind of gave it the name of being a refuge. Rome, in the year 218 BC, became the ruler of the island. And with them traveling and everything, with all the problems they were having, God had told Paul that they were going to survive. As Christians, we know what we do not know what tomorrow's journey will bring to us, but we do know who travels with us. 2 Thessalonians 3:16. Now may the Lord of peace himself continually grant you peace in every circumstance. The Lord be with you all. Well, God was watching over Paul and all the fellow travelers. I wish I could see what was behind me. So Luke was able to report then that in Acts 28, verse 2, the natives showed us extraordinary kindness, for they kindled a fire and took us all in because of the rain that had started and because of the cold. Well, Randy told us before that because of the feast and everything, it was later in October. So this was sometime between October and November. That would make the temperature about 50 degrees. Okay, to them in the Mediterranean, it was probably cold. To some of it's t-shirt weather. But that's a different story. But that part of the Mediterranean, it would be chilly enough, especially if you're soaking wet and exhausted from fighting out on the water in the ship before it went down, and then standing in the rain. And 2 weeks on fighting this storm would probably cause anybody to feel pretty weak. And the word extraordinary is translated from the Greek meaning not the ordinary. A similar phrase found in Luke 19, verse 11. Oh, I'm sorry, Acts 19:11. God was performing extraordinary miracles by the hands of Paul. And in verse 2, like Dr. Maynard said, barbarians, somebody says, well, they're just barbarians. Well, we think kind of bad about them. But all it meant back then was that they did not speak the beautiful Greek tongue. They spoke their own language. But when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened itself on his hand. There's a lot of skeptics that disregard the snake altogether. And they say, well, how could it really, even if it was a snake, how did it latch onto him? Well, it didn't have little arms or anything like that. So exactly, it had the fangs. The fangs sank into his skin, and Paul spent a lifetime of working, so it wasn't uncommon for him. He went out to get, it says, a bundle of sticks for the fire. And in chapter 20, verse 34, you yourselves know that these hands served my own needs and the men who were with me. So it wasn't uncommon for Paul to do the working. He couldn't sit around and do nothing. That might be where I get what I do. I can't sit around too long until I start getting anxious about something. Well, back to the snake, they don't coil. They don't have hands, like John says. They got fangs, they sink in. And the fact that now there's a lot of skeptics that say there's no snakes there. Granted, and I'll show you why in just a minute, there probably aren't any snakes there. But back and during Paul's time, there were probably a lot of snakes there. Malta, like I said, is 18 miles long, 8 miles wide, and one of the most densely populated spots on Earth. Roughly 3,000 people per square mile. The fact alone is sufficient to know that probably not going to be a lot of snakes. In the year 2023, the population of Malta was 535,064 people. Now, the reason there probably are no snakes there now, this is what Malta looks like now. See any place where snakes might be? How about that? that's Malta now. So yeah, I can see where there's probably not any snakes there. So, um, so the deal with the skeptics now saying that they weren't there and the natives were there. The natives knew that they were deadly snakes. And so when the natives saw the creature hanging from his hand, they began saying to one another, undoubtedly this man is a murderer. And though been he has been saved from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live. Well, they knew Paul was probably one of the criminals, one of the guilty prisoners, because most of the ones that were there, minus the crew, of course, were prisoners, and some of them could have been shackled. And when the snake bit Paul, and they said, obviously, he didn't die on the sea, so he's here. They were pagans, and they believed that if in the past, evidently, somebody had been saved from the sea, then something else happens to them. They think this snake was one of their gods, one of their pagan gods, that was going to kill Paul, and so therefore his justice was taken care of. And then Paul shook the creature off into the fire and suffered no harm. Now, if remember when Jesus sent out the 70, he told them in Luke chapter 10, verse 19, behold, I have given you authority to tread on serpents and scorpions and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing will injure you. Then when he gave them the Great Commission, he pointed to the apostles, and in Mark 16, verse 17 and 18, these signs will accompany those who have believed. In my name, they will cast out demons. They will speak with new tongues. They will pick up serpents. They will drink any deadly poison. It will not hurt them. They will lay hands on the sick and they will recover. This incident with Paul is the only reference in the New Testament where this has happened, where the snake biting him. And he was not harmed. He didn't do it on purpose. This was an accident. It was not purpose that he picked up the snakes. And snake handlers and cults of today are misapplying the scriptures, thinking that they can do this and nothing is going to happen. Well, Matthew chapter 4, verse 7, Jesus said to them, on the other hand, it is written, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test. But they were expecting that he was about to swell up, this is verse 6, or suddenly fall down dead. But after they had waited a long time and had seen nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and began to saying that he was a god. And when a venomous snake strikes, the poison enters the bloodstream, breaks down the capillaries, and causes massive internal hemorrhages. The affected area begins to swell, and if the poison is sufficiently powerful, the victim will die almost instantly. When I first got to Vietnam, we had our in-country briefing, and they told us there's a viper called a many-banded crate. They nicknamed it, or everybody called it the two-step snake. And the reason it was a two-step snake, because if you got bit, the next two steps you take will probably be your last. That's how quick the poison affects. Well, you know, some of the skeptics admit that the snake bit Paul, but they say it wasn't poisonous snake. I believe the islanders that were there at the time probably knew very well that it was a poisonous snake, because they stood back waiting for him to drop down dead. And since he didn't, um, they thought, okay, there's something different here. Maybe God is watching over him.
Oh,
Yes.
there's one thing I remember from growing up around Coos Bay too. Those harbor snakes are very deadly, and they're all
Yes,
over the place. at
that's
night
true.
especially.
Very true. Um, Now, we were talking about the natives kindling a fire. Uh, before I read this, I thought, okay, you got a campfire and you put a few logs around there, and everybody kind of gathers around, 6, 8 people. How big do you think this fire was? There was 276 people off of that ship. How big of a fire would they, 276? How big of a fire would they need for everybody to stand around to warm and dry themselves? It had to be a pretty good sized fire. And when it says Paul went out and picked up some sticks, okay, if you got a fire that big and you go out and pick up a few sticks and throw on there, it's probably not going to do a whole lot of good. Uh, when Karen tells me to go out and get a stick of wood, if I came back in with a little stick like that, she'd send me back out again.
Which year would you?
But a stick of wood, about this big and about this big around, that's a stick. I don't know how many of them Paul carried. He may have had an armload, but Paul was one that would get out there and work it. He wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty, and he wasn't afraid to get somebody else to help him maybe. But they had a very large fire, and so it had these sticks in his arm. And he throws the fire on the fire, and the snake jumps out and bites him on the hand. My first thought would be to do something like Paul, shake it off, and I'd probably run like crazy. Me and snakes don't get along, but he just shook it off and just didn't think anything about it. Any questions or comments or yes, Mike?
I've often wondered why Paul didn't take this opportunity to say, I'm not a God, after he healed the dysentery and all that, and they looked up to him so much, I'm not a God, and teach them about the real God and teach them the gospel, basically, that's what he was always trying to do. I've often wondered why he didn't do that. It never says he did, to all the people there.
No, it doesn't. But if you remember back when, I don't remember where it is, maybe all the smart people do, when they thought Paul was a god, and he says, no, I'm just a man like you. And then they were going to kill him. Well, this time he had the snake try to kill him, and he shook it off. And at first they thought, he's going to die. And now they thought he must be a god. It doesn't say that they started worshiping. It doesn't say that he said anything after that. But probably actions speak louder than words. So he had the opportunity, but it's kind of a switch from what had happened before.
I just was curious about that. I've often wondered that, reading that, but doesn't mean he didn't do it.
That's true.
Road, I guess.
And that's what I thought, and I had the reference earlier where when they said that he was a god and they bowed down, he said, no, I'm a man like you, stand up and let's just get it over with. Then they decided to kill him, so. Exactly. Okay, moving along.
Hey, what scripture was that in?
Matthew was Matthew chapter 4, verse 7. And
The second scripture where it says, verse 19, what is that?
that is Luke 10, verse 19. Okay. Now we're caught up. So now in Acts 28, starting in verse 7 through 10. Now, in the neighborhood of that place were lands belonging to the leading man of the island named Publius, who welcomed us and entertained us courteously 3 days. And it happened that after the father of Publius was lying in bed afflicted with recurrent fever and dysentery, and Paul went in to see him, and after he prayed, he laid his hands on him and healed him. After this had happened, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases were coming to him and getting cured. They also honored us with many marks of respect, and when we were setting sail, they supplied us with all we needed. When Luke recorded that this person was let's see how I put it again, was a leading man of the island. He was a Rome-appointed governor of Malta, and he welcomed them in, entertained them. Now you can picture they come off of the beach, soaking wet, cold, and he takes them to his place, his cozy little apartment. Luke doesn't record. It says Luke does not tell us how many were included in the word us. When he said they took us to his place there. So it's hard telling, was it a few, was it many? It doesn't tell us. But apparently sometime after this 3 days, I'm sure with the compound for the governor, they probably set him up with some more permanent places to stay instead of down on the beach. Verse 8 says, as Paul entertained by Publius, we might expect him, let's get there you go. And it happened that the father of Publius was lying in bed afflicted with recurrent fever and dysentery. And Paul went in to see him, and after he prayed, he laid his hands on him and healed him. Now, picture Paul sitting there talking to the governor. Now, some people would start saying, okay, let me tell you about this trip out on the ocean, out on the sea, what it was like for 2 weeks fighting this thing. And then when we got here, and then you're not going to believe that I can just picture somebody saying, and then don't forget, let's not forget the snake bite, and on and on and on. Paul didn't do that. Paul sat there listening to the governor, and he found out that his father was very ill, and which should lead us all to understand one thing. God gave us one mouth and 2 ears. So we should be listening. I'm talking to me too, okay? We should be listening twice as much as we talk. And you find out a whole lot more from your fellow brothers and sisters of what is affecting them. And it gives us the opportunity on how to help them. But like I said, Paul did nothing but listen. And so he learned quite a bit about Publius' father. And now Luke, being a physician, the governor's father apparently had Malta fever, and a debilitating disease that could persist for 2 or 3 years. We think a cold for 7 days is bad. It was discovered in 1887 that Malta fever is caused by a microorganism in the milk of the Maltese goats. So if you go there, don't drink the goat milk. This disease is known by different names in different parts of the world. The scientific name is brucellosis or something like that. This disease causes chills, fever, weight loss, joint and muscle pains, enlarged spleen. Serious complications such as encephalitis may also arise. But when I read that, I thought, this sounds like a commercial for some of the disease, the medicines they've got now. The cure is worse than the disease, so. But after learning of Publius's father, Paul went in to see him. He prayed and asked God to help. Convinced that God wanted the man to be well, he laid his hands on him and he was healed. Now, verse 9, after this had happened, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases were coming to him and getting cured. This scene is kind of reminiscent of the healing service at Capernaum after the word spread concerning Jesus' healing of Peter's mother-in-law. The healings on Malta are among the last, if not the very last, miracle ascribed to Paul. And it's one thing that it says they were, the rest of the people on the island had diseases were coming to him and getting cured. Well, the Greek does not translate it that way. The Greek is translated, the rest came up and were cured. It doesn't say they came up to him. It says they came up and were cured. And the cured is different from the word translated as healing. The details with the fact that Luke was among those later honored by the islanders, he led the speculation that Luke ministered as a doctor. Between Luke and Paul, Paul with his miracles, this suggests the earliest work on a medical missionary. So I thought that was very interesting. Okay, they spent the next 3 months on the island. Any questions or comments up to, yes, ma'am?
That disease is brucellosis, and we know it as Bailey's disease.
Okay.
They got it from the goat's milk, but we've had it, and it's been eradicated, but we know it from the cow.
Okay, so I gotta quit drinking milk.
Pasteurized them.
Oh, okay. Yes, sir.
In the cows, it causes abortion or calves and they won't reproduce. Bank's disease.
Don't buy the hamburger either then.
That's when it's totally been eradicated. Prevention or anything anymore.
Okay. But we can see back then, they didn't have the same technology we have now. And it's hard to tell how many of the people actually got that disease. And how long did it take them to figure out it was from the goat's milk? Yes, sir.
Most of the people that had it, I know Paul Harrelson was our friend, he had little Dixie. It was caught in package plants through the blood. And, but it was pretty common up until probably 20 years ago.
Well, when it lasted 2 to 3 years, hopefully it doesn't last that long now.
Well, the sores, Paul, would come out and you never heal them up. They had a treatment for it, or up at Muskogee at VA. They put them in heat control. And it had to be a totally heat control wrapped environment they put them in, but they never totally healed. It was pretty bad disease.
Well, I'm glad the doctors and scientists have found something that we can beat it with. Any more comments or questions? I found this whole thing in studying this very interesting. To think, to be on a shipwreck and going through what Paul and the rest of the crew went through. And sorry about that. In verse 10, they also honored us with many marks of respect, and when we were setting sail, they supplied us with all we needed. Now, they were on this island for 3 months. And some indicate the fact that while Paul was there, Luke never indicates that Paul did any preaching. it's not indicated that he did any preaching. However, you can imagine Paul when he's talking to them and between Paul and Luke, healing these people, curing these people, that surely he says, Jesus' name was brought in as far as how he healed, why he did it. So more than likely, Paul did some preaching. It just didn't say that he did in our reading. And Paul, when they got ready to leave, may have had a lot of mixed feelings about actually leaving the island. He may have thought that, okay, there's a lot more for me to do here, but then he was not where he wanted to be. He wanted to be in Rome. Now, how many of us have ever thought sometimes we're not where we want to be? Being in the military, sometimes where we were stationed, New Jersey, we were a place we really didn't want to be. And I can understand Paul wanting to move on, but I can also understand him wanting to stay to do more, if you will, missionary work there on the island. So when they set sail and they supplied us with all that we needed. So evidently the islanders, maybe the governor had his words put in also, supplied them, resupplied their ship because the centurion commandeered or at least got another Alexandrian ship that was going to Rome, and they reboarded the ship and took off and went to Rome. And Randy will tell you all about that next week when he gets back. Any comments? Yes, John?
Did you give us a number of about how many folks they're gonna, back in Paul's time?
No, because they didn't take a census back then.
Well, no.
It doesn't say how many were there.
Or was it just sparsely, or was there already a bunch of?
There was probably a few there. I don't know how many populated back then.
Well, I've always thought that was just a few names.
I don't suspect there was that many there, but as you could see by the slides, now
Now there's lots of buildings that are built clear over the island.
3,000 people per square mile and 18 by 8, and McAllister's 17 square miles, and I forgot, or 18 square miles, and I forgot what the population is, what, 17,000? Something like that.
It's been the same ever since I've been here.
So, next week, just so I don't have to tell you what it is, that's next week's lesson for you. Okay, any more questions or comments? Well, thank you very much for your paying attention and putting up with me. And hopefully Randy will be back next week and have a little more information for you. But thank you for being here, and we're getting ready to ring the second bell, so. I enjoyed studying this stuff. I'll tell you what, it was a lot of fun.